When Napoleon's army entered Moscow, victory did not sound the way victory was supposed to sound. There was no emperor waiting to negotiate, no crowd offering submission, no city handing him the political ending he had marched so far to claim. The streets opened before the Grande Armée, but they did not welcome it. Houses stood with doors shut or abandoned, shops were stripped, courtyards were quiet, smoke already moved in uncertain places. The army had reached the city it believed would decide the war, and the city answered with absence. First came the march that made Moscow seem necessary. Then came the streets that refused to behave like a prize. After that came the waiting, when possession itself began to feel like a trap. By September 1812, Napoleon had not come to Russia merely to win a battle. He had come to force a political decision. His army had crossed immense distances, pulling men, horses, wagons, artillery, uniforms, orders, and imperial confidence deeper into a country that refused to behave like Europe was supposed to behave under French pressure. Roads stretched, supplies thinned, villages emptied or burned. The Russian army withdrew again and again, trading space for time. Then came Borodino, one of the bloodiest battles of the age. Napoleon held the field, but the victory did not deliver the thing he needed most: surrender. The Russian army was wounded, but not destroyed. Tsar Alexander did not ask for peace. Still, Moscow remained the great visible prize. If Napoleon entered it, the old logic of empire suggested that politics would follow geography. Take the city, wait for the message, turn military success into settlement. That was the expectation Moscow carried before the first French soldier reached its streets. To enter Moscow with the Grande Armée was to bring exhaustion into a place imagined as reward. Soldiers had marched through dust, hunger, heat, disease, and the smell of animals dying along the roads. Boots were worn, horses were failing. Uniforms had become less like imperial display and more like cloth holding fatigue together. Men who had crossed half a continent looked toward Moscow not only as a city, but a shelter, food, rest, and proof that suffering had meaning. But the first experience of Moscow was not abundance, it was uncertainty. Streets that should have carried officials, merchants, clergy, servants, and bargaining civilians seemed strangely thinned. Doors were closed, storehouses were not waiting open, many residents had left. Authorities who might have received the conqueror were missing. The city was physically present, but politically absent. A soldier could step into a house and find rooms still shaped by life, furniture, icons, utensils, traces of haste. Yet those rooms did not feel like surrender. They felt interrupted. A table might remain, but not the family. A courtyard might stand, but not the service that made it useful. What Napoleon had taken was not a capital bending into obedience. It was a vast structure whose normal functions had been removed. The unease sharpened because every hour inside Moscow made victory less usable. The army needed bread, fodder, shelter, discipline, and certainty. Officers tried to turn arrival into occupation. Quarters had to be assigned. Patrols had to move through streets that did not explain themselves. Men searched cellars, kitchens, stables, and courtyards for food, forage, firewood, and anything that could keep bodies and horses alive. That was the first reversal. Conquerors were not receiving tribute, they were scavenging inside the prize. A building could offer walls but no provisions. A stable could offer smell and straw, but no horse fit for use. A shop could offer a counter, but no trade. A city that should have fed imperial victory instead forced the army to spend strength making occupation barely functional. Then the fires began to matter. Flames appeared in different parts of Moscow, not as one clean event, but as a growing threat that changed the meaning of shelter. Wooden structures, abandoned spaces, wind, confusion, and deliberate destruction all fed uncertainty. A city taken for rest started to become a place the army had to survive. The French had expected Moscow to concentrate Russian power. Instead, power had moved away. The army occupied streets, but not obedience. It entered the Kremlin, but the Tsar's will remained elsewhere. The conqueror had arrived at the symbol, and the symbol refused to work. The shift came in the waiting. Napoleon could occupy a room in Moscow, receive reports, look over papers, and still believe the old pattern might return. Somewhere, a message should come. Somewhere, Alexander should recognize the scale of the loss. Somewhere, the possession of Moscow should turn into negotiation. But each day without that message changed what the city meant. The stripped houses were no longer only traces of flight. They showed that the prize had been emptied before it could serve him. The fires were no longer only damage. They made shelter unstable. The missing officials were no longer a ceremonial problem. Without them, there was no authority inside Moscow able to turn conquest into settlement. This was the real collapse of victory. Napoleon had won entry into a place, not control over the war. He had reached the city his strategy had made necessary, only to discover that Russia had shifted the meaning of the campaign away from any single city. Distance, weather, supply, exhaustion, and refusal were becoming stronger than occupation. The Grande Armée was no longer simply inside Moscow. It was deep inside a problem Moscow could not solve. The further it had marched toward decision, the farther it had moved from safety. That is why Napoleon's victory in Moscow feels so strange. No enemy army threw him back from the gates. The city was entered. The prize was reached. The imperial image still had its shape. But conquest depends on more than arrival. It needs recognition, supplies, obedience, and a future that can be commanded from the place taken. Moscow gave Napoleon the image of success while denying him the machinery that made success useful. Soon the waiting would become retreat. The retreat would become cold, hunger, pursuit, and collapse along the roads back west. But the disaster first became visible in Moscow, in the gap between possession and control. Napoleon's soldiers had marched toward a victory that was supposed to end the campaign. Instead, they found closed rooms, uncertain fire, missing authority, and a brutal lesson. Taking the prize is not the same as winning the war.